Hello Tool Kids, this is Greg Myers at Tools4Teens, and today we're going to talk about preparing surfaces. Well, there's all sorts of ways of preparing surfaces, and when you think about that, you might think about, well, what do you do to scrub something to make it clean and then take the rust off and whatever. The coarsest thing you might use is some kind of a file like this, you know, for a piece of wood, and that's pretty coarse, and it's all right for some things when you're first getting started with it, but it's a pretty coarse way to go. Another thing you could do is, if you're using metal, is to use a piece of emery paper, and emery paper is crystals of this stuff called emery that's very, very coarse, and it's stuck to a piece of paper. And what you do with that is you rub it usually on steel, and that gives it a little bit of a nicer surface, but there's still a lot of scratches in it. And that brings up the subject of grit. Well, grit is basically how many little crystals there are in a space. And if there's not too many, like this is like 36 grit on a sanding disc, it's still pretty coarse. It's not much finer than having a rasp or a file like that. But in the industry, in the abrasive industry, they call it, they have finer and finer grits. So here's 100 grit, okay, and this is for using on just about anything. It's an all-purpose type of general purpose compound, but it's still pretty coarse, but you can go finer and finer and finer. Here's twice as fine, and that's 220, and you can go to 400 grit and 600 grit, and the thing is, you can go all the way up to 2,000 grit with something that's very, very, you want to get it very, very smooth. And once you get it very, very smooth, and then there's no scratches in it, then you can do something else that's called polishing or buffing. Once you get to a fairly high grit of sandpaper, what you can do is you can start to sand with water. And where the regular sandpaper gets rid of the great big furrows and things, it still leaves a lot of little grooves and scratches. And then if you take and you put some soapy water on whatever you're sanding, it evens out the surface of what you're doing. And that's really where all the elbow work comes in when you're doing certain kinds of surface sanding. Well, there's other things besides sanding, and you've seen people in the kitchen using Brillo pads and scouring pads, and here's a typical type of scouring pad. This is a synthetic material, and this works really well for cutting through rusty surfaces and dirty surfaces on something. And this was developed to replace this, which is steel wool, but it really hasn't replaced steel wool. There's people that like to use one or the other. Steel wool is nice because you can see that you can get very, very fine steel wool for very fine surfaces, and you can get very, very coarse steel wool that will take off the big chunks, but it'll still leave the scratches. Another way to do it would be to use a rotary brush. Okay, well, rotary brushes come in all sizes and shapes, from regular brush, you know, a regular brush that you might scrape on something, to something that you can put in a drill that goes around in circles, and these come in all sorts of different sizes. There's also things like this. These are other rotary abrasives. Now this is really nothing more than a whole bunch of little tiny flaps of sandpaper that are put onto an axle that you can put in a drill. Okay, but then there's other things that's more like stone. Okay, and this is an abrasive stone, and these are different, also different grades of grit, okay, that you can stick into a drill or something like that and get inside of places where you couldn't otherwise get with something like this, or with something that's like a big disc. Okay, so every size and shape, every kind of roundness that you can think of. It gets pretty tiring when you're sanding something, especially for a long period of time, and so they've developed these kinds of things that you can use to put the sandpaper on, okay, that have a nice sponginess to them, so that when you're up against the surface you won't necessarily scratch it. And then there's things that hold the sandpaper, okay, that have some foam in them that allow you a nice easy thing to hold while you're sanding. The key word for today is grit. So once you've got the big chunks out of the way and your surface is sort of smooth, then it's time to do some buffing or polishing. And some people use those two terms interchangeably, and you do it with a cloth wheel like that, okay, that's attached to a motor, or maybe you'll attach it to a drill again, and you'll use a little cloth thing like this, okay. One way or another, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking some different compounds. These are also very fine grits, okay, and these compounds that are kind of impregnated in wax are used with the buffing wheel, okay, to get a shinier coat. And there are different kinds of grits and different kinds of sticks that you would use depending on the type of metal that you're working with. Well, there's one that's a very black type. This is called an emery stick, and that's something you might use with a piece of steel, something like this, iron or steel, okay. And then there are other kinds. There's this kind, which is called jeweler's rouge, which you'd use on softer metals. This would be good for brass or copper or silver, okay. And this one is maybe a little harder. This is called Tripoli. This is a good all-around one to use. And then there's this white one, okay. And the white one, okay, is for use on things like chrome and hard metals, okay. Then there's a yellow one, which is good for things like stainless steel. Anyhow, we're going to clean up a few things now and show you what we can do. Let's start out with a piece of soft, like bronze here. And this is just a wire wheel. Let's see what this does all by itself. Well, that gets that pretty shiny, doesn't it? There's still some scratches and bumps and things in it. But we're just going to come over here now, and we're going to use some soft compound. see if we can get this a little shinier, huh? Take a look at this under the bright light here. Wow, that's just like gold. That's so bright. Look at that. Okay, and this is how it started, like this. Okay, and this is how it ended up, like that. Pretty cool. Let's take a rusty old bolt, okay? Let's take a rusty old bolt and the head of this rusty old bolt, see what we can do. Well, wow, that's really looking pretty good. Now, let's take some of that other black stuff, some of the emery stick, and put that on here. Okay, and let's see if we can shine that up. Now, of course, the amount of time that you spend at the wheel is going to determine how nice the finish is, but look at that. That looks like brand new. Look at the rest of the bolt. But look at that. And when you're fixing up an old car or something like that, this is what you're doing a lot of the time is you're taking pieces of metal and you're shining them up and you're getting rid of the rust. And you're always going to use metal that you know is good, okay, for the purpose that's safe. But that's a lot of what you're doing. Okay, now we're going to take this old hammer here, which I've had since I was a kid, and we're going to put it in this thing that's called a sandblaster, okay? And a sandblaster basically shoots little grains of sand at the metal, and by doing so, just like if it was sandpaper, it goes ahead and it basically grinds off the outside surface of whatever you're aiming it at. And this is a little hard to show you on a video, but I'm going to put this in here and we're going to shoot the sand at it, and then we'll take a look at it. Here's the gun that we use with sandblasting, and what happens is that compressed air comes up through here and it gets pushed out using that trigger, and then this right here is a sucker tube, and sand comes up here, and then the air that rushes through here brings the sand around the corner here, and it comes out here and blasts whatever it is that we're going to sandblast. Now look at this. Here we got this whole hammer got sandblasted, and it looks like a very dull finish here, which is what you want sometimes when you're going to have paint on it or something. But now watch what happens when I use the rotary wire wheel on it. What a surprise under there. Look at how shiny that gets. And that's just from barely even touching it. Just think what'll happen if I put it on the polishing wheel. It gets so bright you can't even look at it. Well, kids, that's all I've got to tell you today about surface preparation. on Tools for Teens. We'll see you next time.